Security, please escort Miss Ashford from the premises. She's been terminated for theft of company resources, and we want to make sure she doesn't take anything else on her way out. My manager Richard announced to the open office where 30 of my colleagues sat frozen at their desks, their eyes following me as two guards materialized at my sides. We've documented everything, Vivian. The unauthorized use of equipment, the after-hours access, the projects you claimed were personal development. You're lucky we're not pressing charges. The humiliation was complete and public, designed to be witnessed, designed a message to everyone watching that even minor transgressions would be punished dramatically. But why did I walk out without protest or tears? And why, exactly 1 week later when the mandatory all-staff meeting was called, did Richard's confident expression collapse into sheet-white terror when I entered through the executive entrance alongside the board of directors? The building's name was etched in marble above the main entrance. Ashford Business Center. Richard had worked in that building for 7 years without ever connecting the name to anyone real. Ladies and gentlemen, the board chairman announced to the assembled employees, thank you for gathering on such short notice. I'd like to introduce Vivian Ashford, who will be explaining some significant changes to our organization. 30 faces, the same faces that had watched my humiliation 1 week earlier, turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. Richard sat in the front row, close enough for me to see his hands trembling. Good morning, everyone, I began. For those who don't know me, and apparently that includes management, my name is Vivian Ashford. My family owns this building. We also own approximately 40% of this company's stock. The silence was absolute. 1 week ago, I was escorted from this building by security, accused of theft, and publicly humiliated. Today, I'm here to discuss what actually happened and what's going to happen next. The job at Meridian Technologies had been my choice, not my family's. The Ashfords had built their wealth through real estate and strategic investments over 3 generations. My grandfather had constructed the business center that bore our name. My father had expanded the portfolio to include equity stakes in dozens of companies, including the tech firm where I'd chosen to work. I'd wanted to build something of my own. At 24, fresh from graduate school, I'd applied to Meridian Technologies using only my first name and mother's maiden name on the initial application. By the time HR processed my paperwork and saw Ashford on my legal documents, I was already hired based on my qualifications. I'd asked them to keep my family connection private. I want to succeed based on my work, I'd explained to the CEO who'd been informed of the situation. Not because of who my family is, he'd agreed impressed, he said, by my desire to prove myself independently. For 3 years, I'd been Vivian to my colleagues. Just another junior analyst working her way up, earning promotions through performance, building relationships based on who I was rather than what I owned. Richard had never thought to investigate further. The theft accusation had emerged from my after-hours work. I'd been using company equipment, computers, design software, prototyping tools to develop a side project on my own time. A productivity application that I'd conceived, designed, and built entirely outside of work hours. The project had nothing to do with Meridian's core business. It addressed a different market, solved different problems, used different technology stacks. But Richard had discovered my late nights in the office, had seen me working on something that wasn't company business, and had concluded that I was stealing resources. His investigation had been thorough in the wrong ways. He'd documented my access badge swipes. He'd cataloged the software I'd used. He'd compiled screenshots of my project that someone in IT had captured without my knowledge. What he hadn't done was ask me to explain. The termination meeting had been designed for maximum impact. Richard had called me into his office where HR was already waiting. He'd read a prepared statement about misappropriation of company resources and violation of employment agreements. I tried to explain. The project isn't related to company work. I developed it entirely on my own time, using company equipment, company software, company facilities, after hours, on my own time. The employment agreement allows for personal development activities, not when those activities involve stealing our resources to build competing products. It's not a competing product. It's a completely different market. That's for legal to determine. Richard had stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Security will escort you out. We'll mail your personal belongings. The walk through the open office past 30 colleagues, past the guards flanking me, past the whispered conversations that would follow me out the door had been the point. Richard wanted everyone to see what happened to people who crossed him. The week between my termination and the mandatory meeting had been eventful. I'd called my father first not for help, but for information. I need to know our exact position in Meridian Technologies. 42% of voting shares. Why? Because I was just fired for theft, and I need to know what options I have. The conversation that followed had been illuminating. My father had built relationships with Meridian's board over 15 years of investment. He sat on the compensation committee. He'd personally advocated for the CEO's hiring. The family stake made us the largest single shareholder. What did they accuse you of stealing? Computer time, software licenses, the ability to work on personal projects after hours. That's in the standard employment agreement. Personal development is explicitly permitted. Richard apparently didn't read that section. My father had been quiet for a moment. Do you want me to handle this? No, I want to handle it myself. But I need the board's attention. You'll have it. The board meeting had happened 3 days after my termination. I presented my case methodically. The employment agreement that explicitly permitted personal development activities using company resources during non-work hours. The documentation showing that my project was completely unrelated to Meridian's business. The timeline proving that all my work had been done after hours, on my own time, with no impact on my regular responsibilities. The HR records showing that my performance reviews had been consistently excellent, that I'd exceeded my targets every quarter, that there had been no complaints about my work until Richard discovered my side project. The termination was procedurally improper, substantively unjustified, and conducted in a manner designed to humiliate rather than protect legitimate company interests, I'd concluded. I'm not asking for my job back. I'm asking the board to address the management failure that allowed this to happen. Board's deliberation had been brief. The mandatory all-staff meeting had been called for the following Monday. Richard had been told only that there would be organizational announcements. He'd spent the intervening days apparently congratulating himself on his decisive handling of the theft situation. He'd mentioned to colleagues that his swift action had sent a message about accountability. He'd discussed potential candidates to replace me on the team. He'd moved forward with complete confidence that he'd acted correctly. 1 week ago, I was accused of theft, I told the assembled employees. The specific accusation was that I misused company resources by working on personal projects after hours. Click to my first slide, the employment agreement every employee had signed. Section 7.3 of our employment agreement explicitly permits personal development. Activities using company resources during non-work hours, provided such activities don't compete with company business or interfere with job responsibilities. The text was highlighted on the screen. My project didn't compete with Meridian's business. My job performance exceeded expectations. The termination was therefore not just embarrassing for those involved, it was a violation of the employment agreement that this company uses to attract talent. I clicked to the next slide. But the termination itself isn't why I'm here today. I'm here because of how it was conducted. The screen showed Richard's email to the security team. Make sure everyone in the office sees her being escorted out. I want this to send a message. The words hung in the air. This wasn't a termination based on legitimate policy concerns. It was a performance designed to humiliate an employee, to establish dominance, to demonstrate power. I paused. That email was sent before HR had finished their review, before legal had weighed in, before anyone had asked me to explain my activities. Richard's face had gone from white to gray. The manager responsible decided to make an example of me before verifying whether any policy had actually been violated. That's not leadership. That's bullying. The board chairman stood. Thank you, Ms. Ashford. I'd like to add some context for the employees who may not fully understand the situation. He walked to the front of the room, his presence commanding in a way that made Richard seem to shrink. Vivian Ashford's family owns this building. They also own 42% of this company's voting shares, making them our largest shareholder. The Ashford family has been invested in Meridian Technologies since our founding. The murmuring started immediately. Vivian chose to work here under circumstances that didn't advertise her family connection. She wanted to be evaluated on her merits, not her ownership stake. For 3 years, she succeeded. Every performance review confirms her value to this organization. He turned to look directly at Richard. The decision to terminate her employment, publicly humiliate her, and escort her from the building was made by a manager who couldn't be bothered to read the employment agreement, consult with legal, or ask basic questions before staging a spectacle. Richard attempted to speak. I didn't know. You didn't know she was connected to ownership. Correct. The chairman's voice was ice. But the employment agreement applies to all employees equally. The requirement to verify accusations before termination applies regardless of who the employee is. The basic professional courtesy of a private conversation before public humiliation applies to everyone. If you had fired a random analyst this way, it would have been wrong. That it happened to be in Ashford makes it catastrophically stupid, but the underlying failure was the same. Richard had no response. The organizational changes were announced systematically. Richard Patterson is being terminated from his position as regional manager, effective immediately. HR will coordinate his departure. I watched Richard's expression cycle through denial, anger, and finally something like acceptance. Additionally, the company will be conducting a comprehensive review of termination procedures. No employee should ever be escorted from the building based on one manager's unverified accusations. The chairman turned back to the employees. I want to be clear about something. These changes aren't happening because Vivian Ashford is a major shareholder. They're happening because what occurred last week was wrong and it could have happened to any of you. The aftermath took several forms. Richard was escorted from the building by the same security guards who had escorted me 1 week earlier. The symmetry was noted by everyone watching. Employees who had witnessed my humiliation approached me throughout the day, some apologetic, some curious, most simply recalibrating their understanding of who I was. I had no idea, my closest colleague, Jessica, said. You never mentioned anything about your family. That was the point. I wanted to be just another analyst, but you own part of the company. My family owns part of the company. I wanted to earn my place here, not inherit it. Did you? Earn it, I mean. Every performance review said so. Until Richard decided I was stealing by doing exactly what the employment agreement permitted. The CEO requested a private meeting that afternoon. I want to apologize personally, he said. I knew about your family connection. I should have been monitoring more closely. You couldn't have predicted Richard would react this way. No. But I could have ensured that termination decisions went through proper review. That's a systemic failure, not just a Richard failure. The board is addressing that. They are. He paused. What are you planning to do now? Your position is still available. Richard's termination means the team needs leadership more than ever. I'm not coming back as an analyst. I didn't expect you would. What would bring you back? The negotiation that followed reshaped my role entirely. I returned to Meridian Technologies, not as a junior analyst, but as Director of Innovation, a new position created specifically to leverage the skills Richard had accused me of misusing. The productivity application I'd been developing after hours became a company-sponsored project. Meridian provided resources, I provided the vision, and we agreed to split any eventual revenue. This is what should have happened from the beginning, the CEO observed. If Richard had asked questions instead of making accusations, he could have discovered an employee with initiative and skills beyond her current role. Instead, he saw someone working late and assumed the worst. His loss. Quite literally, he's unemployed, and you're a director. The building's name took on new significance after that day. Ashford Business Center employees who had walked past those words for years suddenly saw them differently. Some approached me with awkward awareness of the power differential they hadn't previously recognized. Others treated me exactly as they had before, professionals focused on work rather than ownership structures. I preferred the latter group. Richard's departure from the industry was gradual but complete. The circumstances of his termination became known through the professional networks that connected everyone in our field. The email about making my escort send a message had been particularly damaging evidence of a management style that prioritized intimidation over due process. He found work eventually, a smaller company, a diminished title, a reputation that preceded him. I didn't celebrate his struggles. The consequences were his own creation. The side project I'd been accused of stealing eventually launched. The productivity application found its market, generated revenue, and validated the work I'd been doing during those after-hours sessions. Meridian's share of the proceeds more than compensated for the computer time and software licenses Richard had claimed I'd stolen. The company profited from the very activities they'd tried to fire me for. The irony isn't lost on anyone, Jessica observed when we reviewed the revenue projections. Richard couldn't see potential. He could only see violation. Some managers are like that, and that's why they end up escorted out of buildings with their names on them. The lesson extended beyond my personal situation. Meridian implemented comprehensive reforms to termination procedures. multiple levels of review, legal consultation for any separation involving disputed circumstances, an absolute prohibition on public humiliation as a management tool. The Ashford Protocols, some employees called them, half joking. The name stuck. 3 years later, I was promoted to VP of Innovation. The role had grown as the company recognized what happened when employees were encouraged rather than punished for initiative. The innovation program I built had generated 3 successful products and numerous improvements to existing offerings. The building still bore my family's name. I still preferred to be evaluated on my work. The final conversation about the incident happened at a company anniversary celebration. A new employee, unaware of the history, asked about the framed email in my office, Richard's instructions to security about making my escort visible. Why do you keep that? To remember what bad management looks like. And to make sure I never do the same thing to anyone else. What happened to the guy who sent it? He learned that public humiliation only works when you're certain you're right. He wasn't. And you? I learned that sometimes the best response to being treated unfairly is patience. Wait for the right moment. Present the facts. Let consequences find their proper targets. They fired me in front of 30 coworkers, called it theft. Had security escort me out like a criminal. The crime? Working on personal projects after hours, exactly what the employment agreement permitted. My manager wanted to send a message. 1 week later, I walked into the mandatory all-staff meeting alongside the board of directors. The building had my family's name on it. My family owned 42% of the company. Richard had never bothered to check who I actually was before staging my public humiliation. He was escorted out the same way I had been by the same security guards, past the same watching colleagues. The irony was precise. The project he'd accused me of stealing became a company initiative. The employee he'd tried to destroy became a director. The message he wanted to send found a different recipient entirely.